Okay, today we're going to look at why and how the United States gets involved in World War I. The last video we looked at the causes of the war in Europe, the long-term causes. We said militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism, and then the short-term cause, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. So today we're focusing more on the United States side of things. I've got my trusty World War I helmet on again. I've changed some of the background photos to some World War I propaganda and images of biplanes. We'll talk more about World War I technology and war technology later. But for now, let's talk about U.S. going from neutrality to war. So neutrality is just referring to remaining neutral. We're not getting involved in this. The war starts in 1914, but the U.S. doesn't get involved until April of 1917. Why is that? What is our deal? Why are we staying neutral? For one thing, the United States is made up largely of immigrants. We consist of people from all over Europe. So it's kind of hard socially for the U.S. to really pick a stand or pick a side in the conflict because we have so many cultural connections to both Britain, France, Germany, Austria-Hungary, parts of Eastern Europe. So the conflict and all those alliances that are set into motion in 1914 really kind of puts America sort of in the middle of all this. All its citizens are kind of like, yeah, we support the Germans and the Austrians, or we support the Allies, we support France and Great Britain, but it's kind of down the middle. If anything, it leans slightly more towards Great Britain and France are more natural allies. We do tend to have a little bit more cultural connections to England, Great Britain, and France. But initially, we're kind of staying neutral because culturally, we're kind of down the middle with our immigrant population. That's not supposed to be there. We'll recap. We'll come back to this later. One of the other big issues that's causing the U.S. to eventually get involved is Germany's use of what's called unrestricted submarine warfare. The Germans have been using subs for quite some time, even prior to World War I. One of their strategies was to sort of break up this naval blockade that Great Britain had put up around it. So you can see here in this picture, this red line, this is the blockade. Britain is essentially trying to cut off all the supplies coming into Germany from different countries abroad to sort of limit its military capabilities. Without food, without coal, without oil, it can't fight a war. So to break up this blockade, the Germans are using submarines. And they're not just targeting British or French naval fleets, they're basically targeting anyone and everything that enters into these waters. They don't know who's carrying goods. A lot of times, the supplies aren't coming over in warships. They're coming over in commercial liner ships. And the Germans don't want to take any chances, so they're basically sinking anything and everything that enters the waters. This is problematic for the United States because we are shipping lots of goods to both the Germans and the Austrians. We're shipping things to the French and British. So we're kind of profiting off of both sides in this, and that ultimately puts us at risk to exposure of torpedoes from these unrestricted submarine warfare attacks. So once we start getting U.S. citizens losing their lives in this conflict, that's another issue that's going to push the United States government towards war. One of the famous incidents of unrestricted submarine warfare that finally pushes the U.S. towards war is the sinking of the Lusitania. Now, there have been many other French and British ships that had U.S. citizens on board. Lusitania was another one. It gets sunk by a U-boat. Here's a painting of it. This is kind of like the final straw. This really pushes the U.S. and puts us in a tight spot and makes us kind of have to make a decision. Do we continue to subject U.S. citizens in harm's way, or do we finally step in and say enough is enough? We have to protect the rights and the freedoms of our citizens. And here's a picture of a U-boat. Get it? Underwater boat. Yeah, okay. So yeah, basically the first step before we declare outright war is President Woodrow Wilson's going to declare, he's going to cut off all diplomatic relations with Germany. Basically, diplomacy out the window, and that's a scary step. Basically, we're no longer willing to talk or communicate and try and work things out peacefully. This is sort of like the last step before a country would go to war. The second big factor that's going to push the U.S. towards war is something called the Zimmerman Telegram, sometimes referred to as the Zimmerman Note. Arthur Zimmerman, he is Germany's foreign secretary. He writes this secret message to Mexico. He sends it via a telegram, which is like you kind of like type out this words and it gets sent, and then they translate it and put it into words or whatever. It's old-timey technology, but back then that was how they did it. And so Zimmerman writes this note to Mexico, trying to basically urge them to attack the United States. This is before the U.S. gets involved in the war. They're basically trying to like head off the inevitable, the Germans are. They're expecting the U.S. to enter the war, and if they do so, they're going to turn the tides against Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire. So Germany's hoping to sort of get Mexico to start a war with the U.S. to keep us out of the war in Europe. If we're too busy fighting Mexico at home, then we'll be less likely to send our forces over to Europe, and that'll give Germany a better chance of winning the war. And to sweeten the deal, to make Mexico go along with this, Germany promises after the war, when they win, they'll basically help Mexico regain the territory we lost, that Mexico lost in 1845 when we fought basically and took Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and parts of Southern California. So once the United States gets a hold of this information, the British intelligence intercepts it, they give it to the U.S., they're like, hey, here's what the Germans are trying to do. The U.S. is just like, what's up, Germany? Totally not cool. And they look at Mexico and they're like, don't even think about it, guys. But here's a map just basically showing you this would be all the land that Mexico would get back if they were to help Germany in all this. So that's another thing that kind of pushes the U.S. towards war. Here's a picture of the encrypted telegram. Another key factor that's going to push the U.S. towards war is the Russian revolutions. In February of 1917, the U.S. was pretty pumped about the revolution in Russia. They were going to get rid of the old czar system, the king and queen system, get rid of the monarchy, and looks like they were going to switch over to a democratic style country. And remember, United States, we like democracy, we like capitalism, that's our thing. And we're like, hey, cool, Russia's on board with this. This could be good. However, not so much. Later in the year, November of 1917, the revolution takes a turn for the worse in the views of the United States because they're not going towards a democratic system, they're going towards the communist system. And we talked about communism before, I won't go into details on that, but this is a severe blow to the U.S. and the Allied efforts in World War I because due to the communist revolution, Russia basically drops out. They're no longer Russia, they're the Soviet Union. They can't finance the war. They're basically broke. They don't want to fight. Their will to fight is broken, so they drop out, leaving a huge gap. And Britain and France are basically looking at the United States thinking, hey, dude, major player in the war just dropped out. We're looking to you guys step up and fill that void. Could you please? So this is kind of huge in influencing the United States and getting some pressure from foreign countries to step up and fill that void. So Congress is the one that's the branch of government that declares war. President Wilson asked Congress to declare war, and Congress votes heavily in favor of doing so, 455 to 56 in favor of war. The 56 people that were against it, who voted no, these people are considered pacifist. Jeannette Rankin, the first woman elected Congress, she famously voted no. She voted no for all the wars during her time while she was in Congress. So you had a divide. You had a lot of people a lot of Americans who were against the war. You had a lot of people that were for it. We'll talk more about those pacifists, those people who were against it, and some of the movement against the war in a different episode. So before we actually get in the war, we have to prepare. We have to start figuring out how to fight a war, prepare for the war. And to do that, we need to reinstate the draft. So we can't just start like picking people off the streets and saying, go fight a war. We have to reenact the draft laws. We have to create what's called the Selective Service Act. That is the law, that is the act that creates the draft. Now we've got essentially a group of young men who we can pick from to then push into war, and that's how we build up our army. Our army is really small at this time. We are not prepared to fight this war. Our enlisted men, our volunteers are really small, so we're going to need to up the amount of troops real quick, and the Selective Service Act is what does that. And we're also going to need to start this massive propaganda campaign to convince the American public to get on board with the war and also to start preparing for the war. One thing, if you're going to fight a war, you have to feed your troops, you have to feed your soldiers. So there's this massive campaign for people to start conserving their food, conserving energy, all in an effort to provide more war food, war goods, war material. So you have these things called victory gardens where, hey, Americans, go in your backyard, grow a garden, and save food so we can ship it overseas to help our soldiers fight the war. We're also going to need to build war goods. And the War Industries Board is going to be managing and transitioning our industries, our factories that were making automobiles. We now need to shift those factories into making tanks and making bombs and making artillery and making rifles and helmets and the whole 9 yards. So that's the War Industries Board. They're looking at managing the technicalities of transitioning and changing these factories. But then on the other side of work, we need to look at the labor side of things, and that's where the War Labor Board comes in. They're going to deal with the social side of war production. How do we deal and compensate people for the hours that they're working? How do we make sure that the workers are treated fairly and not working like 12, 14 hours like the Industrial Revolution that just happened? We can't digress. We can't go backwards in terms of the human aspect of labor in this. So treat them fair, pay them fairly, but let's also crank up the production and make sure that we are producing the war goods to help the Allies win. And then there's more propaganda, more campaigns about conservation and what the War Industries Board is doing, trying to get people to support the labor side of things, support the conservation of food, and to get people to enlist. And then there's a massive campaign, propaganda campaign, to sort of portray the Austrians and the Germans as these really terrible people. So, like I said, our culture, our society was kind of in the middle, but we slightly give an edge to the Allies side. So we're starting to see more propaganda to portray the Germans and the Austrians as these evil people. Like here, like it's this giant King Kong figure that's going to like cross the Atlantic and bash our skulls in. And here's this one with beat back the Hun with Liberty Bonds. I'll explain Liberty Bonds in a second. But look at the bloody hands and the bloody bayonet here, this evil look on his face. It's all an effort to get people to change their perceptions and think that, yeah, the Germans and the Austrians are the bad guys and we have to go fight them. And then the other part, in terms of labor, it's going to create huge opportunities for women in the workforce. With a lot of men enlisting and a lot of men being conscripted into the war, meaning like the Selective Service Act, it's going to create opportunities for women to, fill those factory jobs. And then the other key issue here for war production is the sale of Liberty Bonds. So these are actually it's kind of like a stock, but a little bit different. The government essentially sells these bonds and they mature over time. So you pay $100 now, and then like 4 years, 5 years down the road, whenever that bond matures, the government has to buy it back from you, and you're going to get some interest on it. So you bought it for $100, the government has to pay you maybe, depending on the interest rate, say $200, $300 or whatever. So it's a win-win. You get a long-term investment, and you're going to be guaranteed some money down the road, and the U.S. government gets cash in its pockets immediately, so it can do things like build more tanks, build more submarines, build more naval ships. Whatever it needs for the war effort. Liberty Bonds are what's essentially funding that war. Okay, so let me go back to the recap one, which I should have put at the end. Good job, me. Getting there. There we go, recap. So, United States, why are we getting involved? Propaganda is pushing American society and culture. We're getting a lot of pressure from people saying, yep, we got to join on the side of the Allies. You've got unrestricted submarine warfare, Americans losing their lives on the seas. You've got the Zimmerman telegram, Germans basically trying to convince Mexico to fight against the United States. Hey, start a war with the U.S. and we'll help you out later. And you've got the Russian Revolution. Basically, Russia drops out, they become the Soviet Union, puts the Allies in a tough spot, puts the U.S. in a tough spot, puts the pressure on us, the United States, to join the war. All right, that is U.S. causes for World War I.